We had intelligence information that the Russians were going to put a man around the moon probably in December of 1968.
It's all over. It's all over. We haven't got a chance, not a chance.
From the start, the Soviet Union had taken the lead in the race to conquer space with the successful launch of the first satellite, Sputnik. The first man to orbit the planet was Russian, as was the first woman. The Soviets were also the first to walk in space and the first to send a crew into orbit. Their unmanned spacecraft were first to fly past the moon, to reach the lunar surface, to soft land, and to orbit. In September 1968, Zond 5 became the first spacecraft to orbit the moon and return safely to Earth.
The Russians have landed.
It was then inevitable, as the Soviets looked ready to launch a rocket capable of placing heavy payloads beyond low Earth orbit, that NASA panicked. At least that's the story everyone has been sold by this man, Apollo 8 commander Frank Borman.
He said that the Russians, the CIA had heard that the Russians were going to launch before the end of the year, and that Low was coming up with this plan to send Apollo 8 to the moon, and what did I think about it? I thought, that's a hell of
The real reason for rearranging the Apollo program was far less dramatic.
Despite their indomitable spirit, at Cape Kennedy, the Grumman team were newcomers. They found themselves continually behind schedule, getting the unproven LEM into the flow, on the stack, and to the moon.
By July 1968, the development, delivery, and evaluation of spacecraft and equipment was so far behind schedule, there was no way NASA could meet their own target of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. To this end, the decision was taken in August 1968, a month before the actual launch of Zond 5, to send men into orbit around the moon by the end of the year, cutting at least 6 months out of the timetable and bypassing all outstanding high Earth orbit trials of the command and lunar modules in the process. The Soviets launched their Luna 15 unmanned moon lander on July 13, 1969, 3 days prior to the launch of Apollo 11. Its progress was tracked by the enormous 250-foot dish antenna at Jodrell Bank Observatory in England. Bob Pritchard, an engineer at the observatory, said what others presumed at the time. "I'm sure the intention was to soft land, take a sample of the moon, and get it back to Earth before the Apollo managed to, so they could claim to have done it first and with no risk to human life." But if NASA is to be believed, it was in fact they, not the Russians, who acted both in haste and recklessly by sending 3 men into the unknown in a spacecraft that had not been qualified for a mission around the moon back in November 1968.
Why don't we send the command service module of Apollo 8 to orbit the moon, and we can learn a lot about the communication system, the navigation system, how the moon's gravity would affect the orbiting spacecraft, look for a suitable landing spot.
They did so again 6 months later, sending 3 men to perform maneuvers in another spacecraft that had not been qualified for the mission.
The only way pilots could practice maneuvering and landing the LEM was with flight simulators and awkward lunar lander rigs. Never before had a flying machine gone into actual service without a single test flight.
And less than 2 months after that, Here they were attempting to soft land 2 men on the lunar surface, to have them walk around outside in spacesuits that had never been exposed to a lunar environment, and then to blast off using an engine that had never been tested in a way that NASA had never demonstrated was possible on Earth, let alone the moon.
But to me, the takeoff was perhaps the most critical one, because first of all, there are only 2 people there getting it ready to go, and it's one of those things where it either worked or didn't work. And it had never really been demonstrated. Had never really been demonstrated.
But then NASA had never launched anything from the moon prior to the Apollo 11 mission. So engineer Bob Pritchard was spot on in one respect. The Soviet approach avoided placing human life at risk. But if NASA really had been to the moon twice, why were they so obsessed with Luna 15, an unmanned lunar probe? The truth is, this was the Cold War, and no one outside of the Soviet Space Agency had any idea of the Luna 15 mission objectives at the time. Fellow Apollo team member Bruce McCandless, acting as Capcom back in Houston, updated the crew with the latest news.
In Moscow, space engineer Anatol Koretsky was quoted by TASS as saying that Luna 15 could accomplish everything that had been done by earlier Luna spacecraft. This was taken by the press to mean Luna 15 could investigate the gravitational fields, photograph the moon, and go down to the surface to scoop up a bit for analysis.
That was clearly not enough for Chris Kraft, NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations, who asked former Apollo 8 astronaut Frank Borman to place a call to his friends in Russia requesting confirmation of its flight plan.
Colonel Borman, did you ask, or did they give you any indication of what the mission of Luna 15 is?
They said that it would remain in orbit, in its present orbit, for 2 days, and that they would notify us immediately of any future changes in the trajectory. They also said that at no time would the Lunar 15 trajectory intersect the published trajectory of Apollo 11.
We can only guesstimate what the Russians are doing in this instance, and
does that tell you any more about the mission?
yeah, it says it's a lunar orbit mission.
From the press conference, it's clear that Kraft was concerned about where Luna 15 would be when Apollo 11 reached the moon, which is understandable, if misguided. For though there was always a chance that the only 2 craft in the vast open space above the moon could collide, the real risk to life was NASA's lack of preparation. Regardless of the rivalry, it's difficult to believe the Soviets would welcome a collision. You can imagine how embarrassing it would have been had their unmanned probe destroyed man's first mission to another planet. At least that's how it would have looked on the surface. Because there was never any risk to the crew of Apollo 11, who remained in the safety of a low Earth orbit throughout the mission. No one knew this better than Frank Borman, who had commanded Apollo 8 the first time NASA had deceived the world. Someone else preoccupied with Luna 15 was Buzz Aldrin, who was one of the astronauts aboard Apollo 11 at the time.
Hey Charlie, what's the latest on Luna 15? Roger, latest on Luna 15, TASS reported this morning that the spacecraft was placed in an orbit close to the lunar surface, and everything seems to be functioning normally on the vehicle. Sir Bernard Lovell says the craft appears to be in an orbit of about 62 nautical miles. Over. Okay, thanks.
Are we really to believe anyone, Aldrin included, was concerned Russia might get there first? As if using a robotic spacecraft to recover samples of moon rock would in any way detract from the historic achievement of sending men to bring it back in person. It would, if anything, confirm America's superiority. However, there was another risk that everyone involved in the deception should have been worried about at this point in the mission, and that's the prospect of Luna 15 sending back photos of the Sea of Tranquility, which was where Apollo 11 was due to land in less than 3 days' time. Why? Because there was every chance the Russians and the rest of the world would discover the truth, that NASA had already soft-landed the descent stage of Apollo 10 on May 23rd, some 55 days earlier. This move was the sleight of hand that guaranteed success in every Apollo mission. While the crew of the current mission remain safe inside the command module and lunar ascent stage in a low Earth orbit, NASA soft lands the lunar descent stage at the site of their next mission to the moon. It's the same as landing the Surveyor lunar probe, only larger. So if, like Borman, Aldrin is worried about the possibility of Luna 15 colliding with a spacecraft, it's not the one he's in. It's the unmanned Apollo 11 descent stage, which NASA intends to remote land in the ocean of storms, ready for the upcoming Apollo 12 mission. The reason for his concern is obvious. Crashing is the only thing beyond NASA's control that could alter the outcome of the mission. Everything else is guaranteed, at least from landing on the moon to lifting off safely and splashdown back on Earth. But if disaster should strike, Aldrin knew he and the other 2 Apollo 11 astronauts would have to disappear forever, like the crew in the 1978 movie Capricorn 1.
We are dead.
What?
We're dead.
In the end, Luna 15 did collide with something, the moon. It crashed during its descent hours after NASA studios pulled off the greatest challenge short of actually landing 2 men on the lunar surface, which was to make you, me, and the rest of the world believe it was all real. The Soviets succeeded in recovering their own small sample of moon rock in September 1970, by which time NASA studios had staged 2 more lunar missions. But as we shall see, one of them didn't go exactly to plan.
Anybody ever sees us again and the whole thing falls apart. Simple as that. They can't afford to have us around.
That is the end of my statement.